I was still in the recovery chair, an IV taped to the back of my hand, when my son-in-law walked in holding a manila envelope, like it was nothing more than a grocery list. He didn't sit down. He didn't ask how the surgery went. He set the envelope on the rolling tray beside me, pushed it an inch closer with 2 fingers and said, "We should probably deal with this before you go home, Margaret." I looked at Ryan. I looked at the envelope. My side ached every time I breathed, a deep, stitched-up soreness that the painkillers only dulled around the edges, not erased. I had given part of my liver 11 hours earlier, so that his mother, Audrey, wouldn't die waiting on a transplant list that moved slower every year. I was 63 years old. I had just had a piece of myself cut out and sewn into another woman's body. And my son-in-law's first words to me were about paperwork. "What is it?" I asked, though some part of me already knew. "The way you know a storm is coming before the sky changes, just from the pressure in the air." "It's a release," he said, "for the trust. Once Mom's name goes on as primary beneficiary, your portion reverts back to the estate. Standard, given the circumstances. I want you to understand something about who I was up until that exact moment. Because the woman lying in that recovery chair was not a fool, and I need you to know that before I tell you what happened next. I'd raised my daughter Sandra alone in Barrie, Ontario, after her father left when she was 6, and I'd done it on a payroll clerk's salary, and whatever overtime I could scrape together at the auto plant in the off-season. We didn't have much. We had a townhouse with thin walls and a Honda that needed a new transmission every 2 years. But Sandra never once went without a winter coat or a birthday cake, and I am proud of that in a way that has nothing to do with money. By the time she finished her business degree at Wilfrid Laurier, I had exactly one thing left to give her that mattered. I had taught her to never need anyone the way I'd needed her father, and to never let a man make her smaller to make himself feel bigger. She married Ryan Whitfield 9 years ago. I liked him in the beginning. He was polished in a way that made me suspicious at first, the kind of man who shook your hand a beat too long and remembered your coffee order. But Sandra was happy, genuinely happy, and I told myself that suspicion was just a single mother's instinct for armor, not evidence. Ryan's family owned a string of dental clinics across the GTA. Real money. The kind that buys a cottage on Georgian Bay without blinking. And I watched my daughter step into that world a little at a time, learning which fork to use, learning to laugh at jokes that weren't funny, learning to make herself smaller so the room could stay comfortable. Audrey Whitfield never once made me feel like family. Not in 9 years. She called me Margaret in a tone that made the name sound like an apology she was issuing on my behalf. She corrected the way I pronounced wine regions at dinner parties. When Sandra and Ryan bought their house in Oakville, Audrey sent a card to Sandra alone, with my name nowhere on the envelope, as if I hadn't driven up every Sunday for a year helping them paint and unpack boxes. Ryan always smoothed it over the same way. "She's old-fashioned, Margaret. She'll come around." I told myself that was just how some families were built, brick by careful brick, with people like me standing outside the wall. 2 years ago, Audrey's liver started failing. Cirrhosis advanced faster than anyone expected, and within 8 months she was being evaluated for a transplant. The list for the Toronto General program was long, and her blood type wasn't common, and I watched my daughter come apart a little every week, terrified of losing the mother-in-law she'd spent a decade trying to win over. Ryan came to me on a Tuesday evening in my kitchen, sat at the same table where I'd done Sandra's homework with her 20 years earlier, and asked if I would consider being tested as a living donor. "Your family, Margaret," he said, and his eyes were wet, and I believed every drop of it. "We have to ask everyone who might be a match." I said yes before he finished the sentence. Not because I owed Audrey Whitfield anything. I said yes because I loved my daughter, and because some part of me, God forgive me, still wanted to be let inside that wall after 9 years of standing outside it. I was a match. A good one. Ryan held my hands across that kitchen table and told me I had no idea what this meant to their family, that he would never forget it, that things between us were going to be different now. I let myself believe that too. 3 months of testing later, I checked into Toronto General on a Thursday morning in March. I remember the hallway lights, the particular cold of the gown, the way Sandra squeezed my hand right up until they wheeled me back. I remember thinking, this is the thing that finally makes me one of them. I woke up in a shared room on the surgical floor. The kind with a thin curtain instead of a wall separating me from a stranger coughing on the other side. Not the private recovery suite Ryan had promised. The one on the renovated wing with the view of the lake that his family's foundation had apparently funded. I told myself it didn't matter. I told myself I was being petty, lying there with 40% of my liver gone, worrying about a room. The pain was its own animal. My right side felt like it had been hollowed out and packed with gravel. Every breath pulled at the incision. A nurse came twice in the first 3 hours, checked my vitals, said almost nothing. I kept waiting for Sandra. I kept waiting for anyone. 6 hours after I woke up, the curtain pulled back, and Ryan walked in first, dressed like he had somewhere important to be after this, not a hair out of place. Behind him, in a wheelchair, came Audrey, wrapped in a cream throw that probably cost more than my monthly pension, looking remarkably alert for a woman who had supposedly just received a liver. And beside Ryan, close enough that I noticed before I understood why I was noticing it, stood a woman I'd never seen before, younger, a green dress, a ring on her left hand, catching the fluorescent light in a way that made my stomach drop before my mind caught up. Ryan, I said, my voice thinner than I wanted it to be. Where's Sandra? Did the surgery go well? Is Audrey? That's when he set the envelope on the tray and pushed it toward me. We should probably deal with this before you go home, Margaret. I stared at it. Deal with what? I just got out of surgery. I just gave your mother part of my liver, Ryan. I don't. We're aware, Audrey said from the wheelchair, her voice as clipped and dry as I'd come to expect after 9 years, except now there was something underneath it I'd never heard before. Satisfaction. And it's appreciated, in the practical sense. I don't understand, I said. What's happening right now? Ryan crouched slightly, the way you would to speak to a child, and that gesture alone told me more than his next words did. You were the only viable donor in the family who was also, let's say, persuadable, he said. Single since the divorce. No real assets of your own beyond the trust Sandra's father set up for her education. Emotionally invested enough in being accepted by this family that you'd say yes without asking too many questions. You did exactly what we needed you to do, Margaret, and I want you to know I'm grateful. The room went very quiet except for the IV pump ticking somewhere behind me. You used me, I said slowly, to get a liver. I used you to save my mother's life, he corrected, like he was explaining a line item on an invoice. Sandra's name is on the family trust as a beneficiary because she's my wife. Yours was added 8 years ago as a courtesy. A gesture. When we thought it would smooth things over with her. It never should have stayed there this long. Now that this is settled, my mother would like it formally removed. Today, ideally. The young woman in the green dress lifted her left hand slightly, just enough for the ring to catch the light again. I'm Holly, she said with the easy confidence of someone who had already won something. Ryan and I have been close for a while now. I just think it's important everyone's clear on where things stand going forward. I looked at Audrey's composed, satisfied face. I looked at Ryan's calm, unreadable one. I looked at this stranger's ring, and somewhere underneath the morphine and the disbelief, something in me went very still and very cold. The way a lake goes still, right before it freezes over for good. Where, I asked, is my daughter? Sandra doesn't need to be involved in the financial side of this, Ryan said. I'll handle her. You just need to sign the release. There's a check in there too, by the way. $15,000, for your trouble and for your discretion, going forward, about certain things. And if I don't sign it? For the first time, something flickered across his face, something almost bored. Then we make it considerably more complicated than it needs to be. Your call, Margaret. Audrey smiled. Holly examined her ring. Ryan walked toward the curtain, paused, and looked back at me with the expression of a man already 3 steps into his next meeting. Thank you, he said, for what you did this morning. I mean that. Then they were gone, and I was alone behind that thin curtain with a stapled incision, a check I hadn't asked for, and the slow, sick understanding that I had been chosen for this family the way you choose spare parts off a shelf. I didn't cry. I think I was too far past shock for that. I lay there and stared at the water-stained ceiling tile directly above the bed, and tried to make the last 9 years rearrange themselves into something that made sense. Every dinner I'd cooked that Audrey picked at and never finished. Every Christmas card addressed only to Sandra. I had not been welcomed into that family slowly. the way I'd told myself for 9 years. I had been held at arm's length until the exact moment my liver became useful, and then I had been reeled in just far enough to sign a consent form. The curtain moved again, and I braced myself for another envelope, another flat, businesslike sentence. Instead, a woman in scrubs stepped in and pulled the curtain fully closed behind her, which told me before she said a word that whatever was coming, she didn't want it overheard. "Mrs. Doyle," she said, "I'm Dr. Okafor. I was part of your surgical team this morning." I nodded, not entirely trusting my voice. She pulled the single chair over from the corner and sat down, which is a thing I've since learned doctors only do when they're about to tell you something that shouldn't be delivered standing up. "I need to speak with you about something before the Whitfield family leaves the hospital," she said. "It's a sensitive matter, and I want to be the one to explain it directly." Something cold moved through me, separate from the surgical pain. "What is it?" "During final preoperative verification this morning," she said, "our lab ran the standard last cross-match, the protocol check we do immediately before transplant. It flagged an inconsistency. We ran it twice more to confirm before we proceeded with anything." "What kind of inconsistency?" "Your liver segment was transplanted successfully this morning," she said carefully. "But not into Audrey Whitfield." I stared at her. The room felt like it tilted slightly to one side. "I don't understand." "The recipient," Dr. Okafor said, "is a 17-year-old patient named Priya Nair. She's been on the Toronto General Transplant list for 11 months. Acute liver failure, no living donor of her own who matched. She received your segment at 6:50 this morning, and as of an hour ago, her body is accepting it without complication." "Then where is Audrey's transplant?" I said. "What happened to Audrey?" "Audrey Whitfield was not transplanted this morning," she said. "She was prepped as the scheduled recipient, but when our preoperative blood work flagged a serious discrepancy with her previously submitted compatibility records, our team made the determination, in consultation with the Transplant Ethics Committee, to redirect the donated segment to the next verified match on the registry, which was Priya." "Discrepancy," I repeated. "The compatibility documentation submitted to this hospital 18 months ago, when Audrey was first listed as a potential recipient for living donation, does not match what our lab confirmed this morning," Dr. Okafor said. "There are indications those original records may have been altered. I've already notified Hospital Compliance and Trillium Gift of Life, the Provincial Organ Donation Authority. This isn't something I'm able to keep quiet, Mrs. Doyle, and I wanted you to hear it from me before you heard a different version from anyone else." Altered. The word sat in my chest like a stone dropped into a frozen lake, cracking something on its way down. "They falsified her records," I said. "That's what the evidence currently suggests. There will be a formal review." I lay there with a check for $15,000 on the tray, and a release form somewhere under it, and I understood, slowly, in pieces, that Ryan Whitfield had not simply manipulated me into giving up part of my body. He had likely falsified medical documents, manipulated a hospital's transplant system, and possibly defrauded a public organ donation authority to do it. And he'd done it badly enough that a 17-year-old girl had received my liver instead of his mother. "Priya," I said softly, "is she going to be all right?" Something in Dr. Okafor's clinical composure softened, just slightly. "She's going to be fine. Better than fine, actually. You very likely saved her life this morning, Mrs. Doyle. Whatever else is happening here, that part is real, and it's yours." Something cracked open in my chest that had nothing to do with the incision. "Where are the Whitfields right now?" I asked. "Still in the building. Audrey is being held for further evaluation given the irregularities in her file. Mr. Whitfield and the woman with him are in the family lounge on the 3rd floor." I looked at the release form. I looked at the check. I looked at the water stain on the ceiling I'd been staring at for the better part of an hour. "Need to make a phone call," I said. Her name was Patrice Renault. We'd worked the same payroll office in Barrie for 11 years, before she went back to school in her 40s, and became one of the sharper family law and civil litigation lawyers north of Toronto. We'd stayed close this way. Two women stay close when they've both raised kids alone and watched each other survive it. I hadn't called her enough since Sandra married into the Whitfield family. Ryan had never been outright hostile about my friendships, just quietly dismissive, always wondering aloud, whether I'd be too tired for sex, whether my time wasn't better spent resting. She picked up on the second ring, and when I told her where I was and what had happened, she said one thing before hanging up. Don't sign a single thing. I'm coming. Patrice walked into that hospital room. 40 minutes later, still wearing the blazer from whatever court appearance I'd interrupted. Moving like a woman who'd been waiting years for a phone call exactly like mine. She looked at the release form on the bed, the check on the tray, and her whole face went still and focused. Tell me everything, she said. I told her everything. She didn't interrupt once, just typed on her phone with a speed that told me she was already building a file before I'd finished talking. When I was done, she sat back and said, "Let me make sure I have this. Ryan asked you to be tested specifically, because you were a likely match and easy to convince. There's now reason to believe he or someone close to him falsified Audrey's compatibility records to manipulate the hospital's process. He attempted to get you to sign away your name on the family trust and accept a cash settlement while you were still post-operative, under threat of making things, in his words, complicated." Yes. Patrice looked at the check. $15,000 for your liver and your silence. That's almost insulting, Margaret, even before we get to everything else. I don't want their money, I said. And I was a little surprised by how true that was, lying there. Then what do you want? I thought about Priya Nair, 17. Waiting 11 months for a liver she never knew was coming from a woman across town she'd never meet. I thought about Ryan's flat, businesslike voice telling me I'd done exactly what they needed. I thought about Audrey's small, satisfied smile, and Holly's ring catching the light like she'd already inherited a life that wasn't hers yet. I want them to answer for it, I said, publicly, all of it. Patrice smiled, and it wasn't a kind smile. Then let's go make sure they don't leave this building first. Ryan was standing in the third-floor lounge when Patrice and I came around the corner, me in a hospital gown with an IV pole. I was leaning on more than pushing. Patrice 2 steps ahead like a front moving in off the lake. He looked up, saw us, and for the first time in 9 years I watched something genuine cross his face. Just for a second, just enough. Holly was beside him. Audrey's wheelchair sat near the window. Margaret, Ryan said carefully. You should be resting. Probably, I agreed. Patrice stepped forward, introduced herself in the clipped, precise way lawyers do. When they want the other side to understand exactly how much trouble they're in, and handed Ryan a document she'd drafted on her phone in 40 minutes, which told me she'd been ready for something like this far longer than today. This is notice of intent to file for fraud-based recovery and breach of fiduciary obligation regarding the family trust. In Ontario's Superior Court, she said. You should also know Trillium Gift of Life and Hospital Compliance have both been formally notified of a suspected falsification of donor compatibility records. We have Dr. Okafor's full cooperation. Ryan's jaw tightened. Holly's ring hand dropped to her side. This is premature, Ryan said, his voice stripped of warmth now, just the machinery underneath. The settlement offer was more than generous. Your client made a financial settlement offer to a 63-year-old woman in post-operative recovery. Before she had any legal counsel present, Patrice said. A judge is going to find that very interesting. We're not interested in settling. We're interested in full disclosure. Audrey spoke from her wheelchair, sharp as ever. You have no standing here, she consented. The donation was voluntary. Consent obtained through manipulated medical records isn't valid consent, Patrice said. And a family member specifically courted for 9 years for the purpose of eventually accessing a living donor is going to be very difficult to explain to a jury. The word jury did exactly what Patrice intended it to do. Ryan's eyes moved to the check still in my hand, then down the hallway, where 2 hospital security staff had appeared, and behind them, a woman in a gray suit who I'd later learn was the hospital's compliance director. Ryan looked at me one final time, and the boardroom mask was gone, replaced by something I had never once seen on him before. The specific panicked arithmetic of a man realizing the plan had failed. Margaret, he said, his voice changing again softer, reaching for some version of himself I might still believe in. Let's talk about this reasonably. We are talking reasonably, I said. This is what reasonable looks like when you run out of time. The compliance director reached us and asked Ryan to come with her. He went. Audrey's wheelchair was directed toward a separate room. Holly stood alone for a moment, the ring on her hand suddenly looking less like a prize and more like evidence. And then she walked quickly toward the elevators without looking back. Patrice touched my arm. "You should sit down." "I know," I said, but I stood there a moment longer anyway, watching the hallway empty out of everything that had been built to use me, breathing through the pain in my side, letting myself feel something I hadn't felt in a long, long time. Not happiness, something quieter and older than that, like a woman who'd been robbed and had finally gotten something back, even if it wasn't money. The investigation moved fast once Trillium got involved. The documents originally submitted on Audrey's behalf, the ones showing her as a viable recipient, were confirmed altered within 2 weeks. The real compatibility report, the one buried and replaced, had shown Audrey was never a match for my liver. She never had been. The falsified version had been put together by a private medical consultant the Whitfield family had quietly retained. A man whose license was suspended by provincial regulators before the month was out. Priya Nair went home 5 weeks after the surgery. Her mother sent a letter to the hospital that Dr. Okafor passed along to me, 2 handwritten pages I read so many times the creases went soft. Priya wanted to study nursing. She'd missed most of grade 12 because of how sick she'd been. She was going back in September. The civil case moved quicker than Patrice expected, mostly because Ryan's lawyers made the mistake early on of arguing my consent had been freely given in good faith, a position that fell apart almost immediately. Once Patrice's discovery turned up emails going back nearly 3 years, between Ryan and Audrey, discussing me by name as the most likely living donor in the family, long before anyone had ever asked me to be tested. There were notes about my blood type, pulled from old hospital paperwork after a hip surgery years earlier. There were notes about my finances, about how little I had outside the trust, about how unlikely I'd be to say no. I had not been welcomed into that family slowly over 9 years. I had been assessed. The trust matter was resolved in Sandra's favor, and mine both. Patrice made sure of that. And the fraud findings followed Ryan well past the courtroom, into rooms and boardrooms his family used to walk into without a second thought. Audrey Whitfield found a legitimate match through the proper Trillium registry 16 months later. I didn't feel guilty about any of it. I'd made my peace with the liver long before I understood what it had actually gone toward saving. Sandra left Ryan 4 months after that day in the hospital. She moved back to Barrie for a while, into my spare room. And some mornings I'd come down and find her sitting at that same kitchen table where Ryan had once asked me to be tested, just sitting, working through 9 years of her life rearranging itself the same way mine had. We didn't talk about it much. We didn't need to. I'm in Collingwood now, in a small condo close enough to the water that I can walk down most mornings before the tourists fill the boardwalk. I volunteer 2 days a week with a living donor support network out of Toronto General, talking to people considering exactly what I once did, making sure nobody else signs anything without understanding precisely what they're signing, and why, and for whom. I'm not entirely whole. I won't pretend otherwise. There are still nights I feel the place where part of me used to be, and I think about that kitchen table, and a man who held my hands across it, and told me I had no idea what it would mean to him. But Priya Nair started her nursing program last fall. She sent me a photograph of her first clinical placement, in scrubs, laughing at something just outside the frame, and she doesn't know my name, and that's exactly how it should be. I gave away something I will never get back. But it went somewhere real. It went somewhere it was wanted, and the people who thought they could carve a piece out of me, and leave me behind a curtain with a check and a release form found out, in the end, precisely what I was still made of. If a family can spend 9 years building a wall around you, just to find the one use they had for you all along, would you ever see it coming before it was too late? Or does that kind of calculation always wear the face of belonging? Right up until the moment it doesn't need to anymore?